I'm a couple minutes late here. Let me get rid of this dumb malware. Okay. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with an announcement of the rest of the semester. I'll give you a schedule for that, and I'll show you where it's posted. I'm going to tell you a major problem that I'm having, and anyway, then we'll do the class. The class today for this week, we're going to be talking about the brain. I divided it into 3 parts, and then we'll talk about the quiz that's after that. There's one more quiz, one more exam. Unlike the previous exams, this exam is going to have a lot of overlap from the previous exam, from exam 4, because of the integrated nature of it. So I can't get away from that, and you can't get away from that. You have to remember the stuff from Unit 4 to bring it to Unit 5. So in terms of my problem is, now I've been married for a long time, long before you guys were born, and my wife's birthday is December 3rd.
Tomorrow.
I know that, right? I know that. Well, guess who hasn't bothered going shopping for his wife?
What? And it's December 3rd?
Yeah, you know what
That's
that is?
crazy, bro. And
Why
Black Friday
here?
just passed by. Black Friday, Cyber Monday.
Yeah, but here's the problem with Cyber Monday. Right?
It
Can I
goes
get it by
online.
tomorrow?
No.
Right?
Unless you get
Possible.
Prime.
Well, no, but so there's that problem, but there's also another problem. How do I get her? Right? So that's the other problem. So my daughter is so mad at me. So anyway, so I'm in deep doo-doo. I might be sleeping in the doghouse or in my shed tonight or tomorrow night. We'll see. If I come in on Wednesday and I got frostbite, that's why I slept. Anyway, so I'm not happy with myself. Every once in a while this comes up where I am not organized, and this semester is one of them for my personal quiz. So now in terms of the other thing about this is that the reason why it's directly affecting you is that here's the weekly schedule. I'm going to make this a little easier to read. So this is the first week, this is the second week, and this is the third week. So we only have 3 weeks, parts of 3 weeks left. And then there's Christmas. Some of you are already singing Christmas songs. Some of you are also wanting to be dressed like Christmas and want to go Christmas caroling. They were talking to me about it before Thanksgiving.
Way before Thanksgiving.
Anyway, so this announcement is posted on the website here. I posted it this morning. So look at this is what we're doing this week. Lecture, brain. Look at what we're doing on Friday, Thursday and Friday.
What? This lab? I mean, what?
So now,
Yes.
now, this is posted on the syllabus as well. Because remember, my wife's birthday is tomorrow, and so traditionally my daughter's is Wednesday, so I know that too. And I haven't got her either. But see, I have my wife to fall back on. So I have no idea what the hell we got her, but we got her a bunch of stuff. So as part of that tradition, so several years ago, we have gone away for the weekend to celebrate 2 birthdays. So go up to Maine to this thing called, so since you like Christmas, there's something called a Christmas Prelude in Kennebunkport. And it's a lot of family time, and that's
Are you guys going to bring your son?
my son and my dog, and yep, and so we got to figure out how to do that, yeah. And so for our purposes, for you guys' purposes, there's no lab, in-person lab. I'm going to talk to Ms. Binninger. I'm going to ask her to see if she could give some time to the lab on Thursday and Friday so that you could look at the brains if you're interested. I'll put all this stuff out.
Real brains or fake brains?
So the models, the brain models, not the, so I'm using my real brain. I don't know anyone else. So we don't have any cadavers or anything like that. I'll talk to Ms. Binninger about that. So the other change here is on the original syllabus here, the quiz 8 was supposed to be for Wednesday of this week, and I delayed it till next Monday. So that's when, so quiz 8, just like on quiz 7, was just on one chapter. This chapter will be the brain. Let's start with that. More lectures. next week, December 12th and 13th, we're gonna have the brain practical, and that's the last practical for the lab. And that's the last time we have a formal lab. Okay? And then on Monday, December 16th, we have an exam. December 17th and 18th, I won't be here. So there's no formal lecture, Okay? Once we're done on Monday, December 16th, I stop talking, you stop listening here. Okay, we're not coming back. So on December 17th and 18th, I'll be hanging out at Rhineye, and I'll give you the opportunity to be in the lab, and there's an open lab for you. There will be LT assignments, and again, those LT assignments are posted online. And then Thursday and Friday, December 19th and 20th, is the final laboratory practical. That final laboratory practical, I've said this 400 times, it's cumulative. It's there's 60 questions total, 20 on the bones, 20 on muscles and joints, and 20 on the nervous system. That's going to be in break space. And again, that's for the laboratory assignment, the laboratory practical. So that's in Bod 221. So are there any questions about this? Yes?
So for the lab, it's gonna be, so for the final lab, it's gonna be like a quiz?
So for the final lab, it'll be a quiz or an exam. It'll be in break space. There'll be diagrams and questions and stuff. And once again, it's cumulative. So it goes from cells and tissues to bones, to muscles and joints, to the nervous system. So it's in everything that we talked about over the course of the semester. Okay? Any questions about that?
We're gonna update it today. It's gonna be
So this announcement has been posted already.
alright.
I'm gonna make it a little bit easier to read, but I will. Yes. So this will be. This is already in the Bod 220 on the right hand side. Okay. So are there any questions for me? So in case you're wondering, the way I post these announcements quite frequently, I had someone in my stats class email me over the weekend, do we have class on Monday? And I said, look at the Brightspace webpage. I tell my son to look at the Brightspace webpage because he's at URI too. And he's like, Dad, I already did. And I said, oh yeah, look again. Oh, I found it. So anyway, this is another way that I make this class more accessible than traditional college classes, because I'm so sort of invested in you guys and your education. And I really post a lot of announcements for you. All right, any questions? All right. So let's start with the brain. So the brain, as I said, is divided. I divided it into three parts. The first part is what we're talking about today, and it's the introductory portion of the brain, the major parts of the brain. Tomorrow we'll get into more details of the more advanced portions of the brain, and then on Wednesday we'll sort of clean up anything that's left undiscussed, and we'll particularly finish talking about the cranial nerves. When you're talking about the brain itself, there's 4 major regions of the brain, and one of the things that I find most difficult about this section of the class is that if I am talking about the biceps brachii, if I'm talking about the femur, if I'm talking about some other part of things that we've talked about over the course of the semester, if I'm talking about a neuron even, and an action potential here. So we can talk about the progression here. We can talk about how things go. We can talk about the parts of it. We can talk about the physiology of it. Here, there's the brainstem, cerebellum, the diencephalon, which is a weird word, and the cerebrum. A lot of times, there's overlap, there's redundancies in these things. So one area of the brain will do one thing, and another area of the brain will do another, and then there'll be a third area of the brain that has similar function. So when you get to the brain, there's a lot of overlap between these things. There's only two bones that support you from your os coxae. There's the right femur and your left femur, and that's it. All right? That's not true here. The brain is incredibly complex, and I'm barely even scratching the surface about when we start talking about it. The other thing about this is that the brain itself has a significant vocabulary, and the first of which is the term right here, the diencephalon. In terms of the brain itself and the diagrams and things and the models, you should be able to identify what side of the body is from, just like we've talked about already. Anterior, posterior, this is always posterior, this is anterior. This little ball right here is always pointing anterior. This little thing right here is always pointing posterior, and that's always true. If you ever hear of someone that has been medically induced coma or someone else who was brain dead, then traditionally the area, this brain stem is still functioning, the rest of the brain is not. And it's not that it's not functioning, it's that it's still physiologically functioning, but it's just not consciousness. And so let's continue talking about that. So these four parts of the brain, and the first, what we're going to talk mostly about today is the first two, the simplest parts. I have a couple of pictures here. Generally, here is a picture of a cadaver. This area where my pointer is always posterior. I said this in the previous diagram, and this little bulb right here is anterior. And so this is always pointing towards it. So we're talking it right at the level of the eye. So that if you were to go right into one of your eyes and then continue going back, you would hit a very, very inferior part of the brain. The regions of the brain, again, there's several topics here. There's the brain stem, on the lower left-hand corner here, and that brain stem has parts to it, and that brain stem, so I talked in many of your mini practicals last time with the spinal cord. I said, where does the spinal cord end? Where does the brain begin? Well, now the brain begins right here where my pointer is, and that is at the medulla oblongata. So the structure that's inferior to that is the spinal cord. Where are we anatomically? In the skull. Here we're talking at the level of the foramen magnum and the occipital bone. So that's there, and if you look right there, now, so the medulla oblongata, notice that I'm pointing a little bit lower than this, than where the pointer is. So the medulla oblongata is marked right here, and I put it down here. That's where the brain starts, and the reason why I know that is that posterior to this is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is an important part of the brain, and it is housed, so it rests right on the part of the occipital bone. So the occipital bone runs like this, so the occipital condyle will be right about here. Again, that's posterior here. The brain stem, which is pointing anterior, it's not anterior, it's centrally located. It has three main parts. There's the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The diencephalon is a central portion of the brain here. The diencephalon has three main parts, two of which are shown here or marked here. There's the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and that name hypothalamus right here means something. Hypo meaning below. We talked about the differences between white matter and gray matter, and one common discussion or common comment about people who are smart is they have lots of gray matter. And gray matter is superficially located here anywhere in this part of the brain, right here. And the corpus callosum is the largest area of the brain that has just white matter. So the corpus callosum fundamentally does something different than other parts of the brain. It's really a transfer portion structure. So if you're thinking right now, or if you're hearing right now, or you're using this, generally, this part of the brain, your cerebrum, and if you're looking and you see something on the one side of your brain, or you see something with one eye, or hear something with one ear, and you want to transfer it to the other side, then you're going to, of your brain, then you're going to use this structure right here called the corpus callosum. Again, anterior, posterior is something that, so this would be the right, this is the right side of the brain that we're looking at, and this is a sagittal section. Now, another thing that you have to recognize is that sometimes I'm gonna strip away parts of the brain and we're gonna talk about it. And so if you look at the previous, so first of all, this says the brain stem and the midbrain. And if we take away this thing right here, the cerebellum, and we strip away all of the stuff on the top, the cerebrum. And then we take away, including the corpus callosum. So what are we then looking at here? We're looking at this part right here, this bump right there, and this area right here. And that is what we have here. We have, on the left-hand side, we have the posterior view. On the right-hand side, we have a lateral, more or less lateral view. See this thing right here? This is where the cerebellum used to be. This thing right here is called the pons, and this is always pointing anterior. And so you need to understand what you're looking at here, because I'm going to show you diagrams like this, and you have to be able to understand that. I'm not going to tell you that I'm stripping away the cerebellum, I'm stripping away the cerebrum, and we're just looking at the brainstem and the midbrain. So that's what we're looking at right here. So now if you look at this posterior view right here, traditionally normally we would have the cerebellum projecting laterally and posteriorly, either on the left side or the right side here. Superior to that, here we have these things right here. There's 4 bumps. Those 4 bumps here are, it's not labeled there. The 4 bumps are called corpora quadrigemina. So there's 4 bumps. There's 2 above and 2 below. 2 that are superior, 2 that are inferior, and they're both called colliculi. They have specific, what do you call it? They have specific functions, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. If you look at the, before we get there, I remember I said the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, this is the inferior part of the brain. Superior to that is the pons. The pons, which is over on the left-hand side as well. The pons is directly anterior to the cerebellum, and the pons is right here on the left side. Pons would be left here, and so the cerebellum would be right where my pointer is again. Another thing to look at going superior is that there's this area right here called, first is the inferior part is called the midbrain, and then there's also the diencephalon. Don't worry about the names right now, look at the structures that we're talking about. We're looking at an anterior view of the brain. So this thing right here, this pink structure right here is coming from, now we're looking at the anterior view, so you're looking at me from here. So now where my pointer is, it's coming from the right side, and then there's also the same structure, the matching structure on the left side. They go like this. All right. Where my elbows are is where it sort of progresses to the back, and where my elbows are progresses to the back, and this then is where my hands are what's called the optic nerve, where my fingers are. Where the cross is another point, and then where my elbows is the third point. So there's vocabulary terms here that matter, and where my pointer is one thing. Here's another thing, and here's a third thing right there. So depending on where I am, the names matter. And then the final thing is that you see this point right here where my pointer is. There's a little tube right there. You see right above my pointer, there's a little tube, and that little tube is part of the inferior part of the hypothalamus, and it's leading to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is not in this picture. I'm not sure why it's not drawn in this picture, but a reason why it's not shown in many dissections is because when you remove the brain from the skull, here, when you remove the brain from the cranial cavity, the pituitary gland gets stuck to the brain. It's actually embedded in the sphenoid bone. And so it's embedded in or nestled in the sphenoid bone, and it's attached there. And so the sphenoid, the pituitary gland doesn't hang around or anything like that. It's got this very narrow connection right there called the infundibulum, and that narrow connection then is severed when you lift and remove the brain. So that's why the pituitary gland is not shown there, but I'm not sure why it's not shown there. It should be, because it's a drawing. Let me just see something here. Don't think this is, the pituitary gland would be right here. I think it's not labeled, but this should be right here, where the, just inferior to the infundibulum. More parts of the brain stem here in the brain. So now this is looking at so again, we're looking at the right-hand side of the brain. Again, this is anterior and posterior. The pons, which is a major structure of the brain, is always anterior and inferior. The cerebellum is inferior and posterior. So those are things here. They have the cerebellum has these special cells. These special cells are called Purkinje cells, and they're very, very long. And you notice that the Purkinje cells have this lighter area right here, and that has a special name as well. And that name is called the arbor vitae, the tree of life. These very long cells, these Purkinje cells, have long axons right there, and they send signals and respond to stimuli in this area. There's an awful lot of different types of neurons in this cerebellum part. The cerebellum is divided into 4 areas here, and there's a right and a left side, and then there's an anterior and posterior side. So there's 4 areas here, 2 on the right, 2 on the left, and I think that there's just this anterior lobe right here that's listed right here. So you see this anterior lobe is right here, and the posterior lobe is right there, so there's 2 on the right, 2 on the left. We don't talk about the left or right side, we just talk about the lateral hemispheres, but they're both divided into separate sections here, right and left side. Going further into the brain, into the description here, I mentioned the hypothalamus a little while ago here. So now again, before we get anywhere, this partial drawing of the inferior portion of the brain, you can see where my pointer is, it's got the pons. Posterior to that is the cerebellum, right here. Another set of structures I mentioned in the unit 4, we talked about the central canal and cerebral spinal fluid. Here's where one point of the, there's a significant overlap between unit 4 and unit 5, because where my pointer is one of the areas where there's cerebral spinal fluid. That area right there is going to be coming from superior and bleeding or leaking down into the inferior part of the brain and then continue on its path. If you're going anterior right here, this right here is where my pointer is part of the thalamus. This thalamus is a central part of the brain right here, central part of what's called the diencephalon. The diencephalon here, so the thalamus is the main part, little anterior and inferior. So anterior and inferior where these colored balls are. These colored balls are part of what's called the hypothalamus. And they have these individual, what's called nuclei. And the hypothalamus has these individual nuclei, and they're specialized in determining specific things, specific functions, and they have a number of different things about the hypothalamus, a number of different functions. But the hypothalamus is connected to this structure called the infundibulum, which is not labeled, it's right here. And then inferior to the infundibulum is the pituitary gland. So in this drawing, you see the pituitary gland. In the previous drawings, you did not. So that's another thing about this. Now, that's different here. So again, you have to recognize what you can see and what you can't see, regardless of what I am asking. regardless of what you see, I should still be able to ask you about what structure is inferior to the hypothalamus, what structure is inferior to the infundibulum, things like that. Posterior from the thalamus here, going posterior, here we have an area called the epithalamus. And this area right here, I don't ask about the subthalamus, and in the previous books and previous textbooks, I don't know if I've ever really seen the subthalamus. So when I get to the diencephalon, I'm going to tell you there's three parts. There's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and there's the epithalamus. Anterior to where the hypothalamus is, anterior, just not very far at all. This is a few tenths of a millimeter here, maybe a millimeter or two. There's something called the optic chiasm, and that's right there. There's also another spelling, optic chiasma, with an A at the end. I'm not sure what the distinction is. Regardless here, they're the same thing. And when I said there's this cross right here, and the cross coming from the right side going to the left, and coming from the left side and going to the right, that cross, where my arms are crossed, that's the optic chiasma. So in this drawing right here, if you cut my body in half right here, and you cut right down the midline of where the cross is, you're gonna see part of my right arm touching part of my left arm, and you won't see the appendages, you won't see the fingers. And you won't see this either, right? I gotta flip you off one final time. So that part right there, where my arms are crossed, is right here. So a big part of this is recognizing what you're looking at, which part of the brain you're looking at, where the individual, whether, which is anterior, which is posterior, and things like that. Another thing about the brain is that there's the vocabulary, as I mentioned a little while ago. So now if you look at this diagram right here, so we have the superior portion, the upper part of the diagram is what we just talked about here. And now if you look at these areas right here, where these colored areas, many of them have the same final name here. There's nuclei. So the term nucleus here is a group of cell bodies that are gray matter that have the same function. And so these neurons that are gray matter aren't very long. They're not sending signals very long distance. Generally speaking, where are they sending signals from? If you look up here, the hypothalamus is receiving information from the thalamus. So they're right next door. Again, that's gray matter too. The thalamus then, or rather the hypothalamus is then sending signals inferior to the pituitary. When you get to unit, AMP2, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to start talking about the special senses, and the special senses include taste, smell, and sight here, and vision. And then you're also going to do the endocrine system, and the endocrine system starts, and the master gland for the endocrine system is the pituitary gland. One final thing about the thalamus is up here. The center, the thalamus is sort of, there's a ball on the right side and a ball on the left side, and they're attached by a little circle right there, and that's where my pointer is located. That interthalamic adhesion is a structure that basically attaches the right side to the left side. And that's always easy to identify. The superior part of the brain, the major part of the brain, the part of the brain that we're all familiar with is the cerebrum. The cerebrum has areas of the brain. There's right and left hemispheres, just like the cerebellum. And then they have individual lobes. Each cerebral hemisphere has 4 lobes, and they roughly correspond to the bones of the brain, of the skull rather. So there's the frontal lobe, there's the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and then not visible from this view is the temporal lobe. So this is a superior view of the brain, and you see this major indentation right here, this major separation. That major separation is called the longitudinal fissure. And then there's other separations as well. And those other separations come in a variety of different sizes and depths. So a fissure is a very, very extremely deep separation between the nervous tissue.
the two individual hemispheres. A sulcus is a much milder separation. So in this case, where my pointer is called the central sulcus, and it divides the parietal from the frontal lobes. There's other sulci. So and sometimes those are called fissures, like right there. And this lateral fissure then divides the temporal lobe, which is the one you can't see on the top of this slide, from the parietal and the frontal lobe. And then again, posterior to that is the occipital lobe. Again, now, if you look at this picture right here, I was saying that the brain is starting right here where my pointer is, and then right on top of it, or rather, right here is where you're talking about the occipital bone, basically providing support and protection for the cerebellum, and it goes up and around. And so roughly, we're talking about the bones of the skull here. So here are the major divisions of the brain and their functions. And one of the things that I want you to recognize is that on the simplest things in the brain, the simplest areas of the brain have very clear functions. And as you get more and more advanced in the functions and the functionality of the brain, there's less clarity and there's more redundancy in the brain. So someone who has a stroke a stroke from a medical problem, right? From a blockage in a artery or a vein, right? Some type of medical problem there. They can, after significant occupational therapy and physical therapy, they can learn to do things again if it's a mild stroke. So that stroke would be blocking areas of blood flow to the brain for a particular area of the brain. And so then the patient then could, through physical therapy and occupational therapy, learn to do some of those things that they lost by relearning to do it, by other parts of the brain taking over. So the more advanced in brain structure you get, the more redundancy is and the less clarity there is. Every once in a while I have students ask me, where is a memory stored? And I mentioned this last time too, in the last unit. And I can tell you generally where it's stored, but it's really baffling. It's really, really cool. Like, you can look at my face and know my wonderful head of hair, right? And you don't have to remember that, right? You know what I look like. I know what you guys look like. Where the hell does that recognition stay? Right? There's generally long-term memory and short-term memory, but all we're talking about here are neurons. And so this gets really, really complicated really, really quickly. When you're talking about simple things, the brainstem, for instance, here. Now, there's 4 main areas here. The 2 that are most inferior, the medulla and the pons. The medulla and the pons there, if you look at this, there's general areas right here. Swallowing, breathing, vomiting, and heart rate is part of the medulla. The pons tends to be a reflex center and a relay center. And what are they relaying? They're relaying information from 2 major areas right here. One area is from the spinal cord, and we already talked about the spinal cord. Remember, we talked about the spinal cord having ascending columns and descending columns here. Well, where do those ascending columns go to? In the brain, largely they bypass the medulla and they go to the pons. Those ascending signals then send signals to the pons, and then it says, and then it decides what to do. In addition to the medulla also sends signals to the pons. The pons receives other things as well, and that is cranial nerve nuclei. So there's cranial nerves. There's 12 cranial nerves, and those 12 cranial nerves, there's a bunch of that are attached in the inferior part of the brain, in particular in the brain stem. There's a lot that are attached to the medulla, and then a lot that are attached to the pons. So I said that the pons is getting information from 2 large areas. These are, now, what type of information? This is sensory information going to the brain. This is afferent information. So one direction here, it's the information's already in the central nervous system is those ascending columns, and the other is peripherally from the periphery to the cranial nerves are going to the pons as well. The midbrain then is superior to the pons. The midbrain, if you look at this here, there's ascending and descending nerve tracts here. So again, that's something that is really, that's linked directly to the spinal cord here. Information, the pons sends, serves visual reflex center as part of the midbrain. As you get up to the thalamus here, then you're getting really closely related to or linked to the visual center of the brain. I mentioned about getting back to the pons here. I mentioned that the pons location here is just anterior to the cerebellum. The pons, again, it relays information. So the pons also send signals to the cerebellum and from the cerebellum as well. If you look at these terms right here, the terms that I've had bolded are things that are major structures in the brain, and now underneath this are things that are part of the brain of this section here. So we have the cerebellum and the diencephalon. Those are major sections. I already talked about those. I mentioned the diencephalon has three parts here, and these are the three parts of the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. The cerebrum has a significant vocabulary associated with it. The cerebrum has cerebral hemispheres, there's gray matter, there's nuclei, there's a cerebral cortex. All of those things are more or less redundant terminology. And then within the cerebrum here, and these are areas I mentioned redundancy in the brain and areas of the brain that does really complicated tasks. If you look at these three things, basal nuclei, the amygdala, and the hippocampus here, and you can see these things right here, these functions here: learning and memory, social behavior and emotions, and then muscle activity, inhibiting unintentional movement when at rest. Right? Those things are really sort of higher order things and behaviors, especially with the hippocampus and the amygdala.
So when somebody has like a tremor disorder, would that be like something wrong with the basal nuclei?
So it could be there. It also could be in the cerebellum. I haven't really talked much about the function of the cerebellum. It could be also there as well. So again, there's redundancy within the brain that in really relatively simple tests. The cerebellum helps with physical tests. The basal nuclei help with physical tests as well. So last year, when I was lecturing about this, I would talk about Mrs. Gaspar's son, because back then, he was basically right in this point in his life. Right? He's long beyond that now, because he's over a year old. And this development of the central nervous system here, we're talking about this area right here is early embryo. When we're talking about the embryo here, we're talking about 3 months or so. Less than that, something in there. And then if you look over here, then there's the adult. So you start from a single cell right here. At some point, you all looked like footballs, and then those footballs grew tails. You guys grew tails. Yep, you did. You had little flaps for wings here, those little limb buds. You also had gills, and you had big ass eyes. So these big ass eyes, why were your eyes so big? Your eyes grew, the size, the area of the eye, they're not functional at this point, but they look like they're really big, but they look so big because your brain's so small. So at this point right here, you really only have 3 parts in your brain. Right? There's the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, and unfortunately I'm going to use the other terms associated with that. So there's the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. Here, those are the terms that I'm going to use for that. Again, the terminology associated with it. So now at this point, we have limb buds, we have gills, we have a tail,
right here. In terms of what we're doing here, our lungs don't work, our digestive system doesn't work. They're not that big yet either. The reason why our lungs and our digestive system don't work, well, why?
I mean, you're in a sack of fluid, no? I mean, and we're just there's nothing formed yet.
Well, there are things formed. They're not fully formed. It's not to the level of here. There's no question about it. But why doesn't our lung and our digestive system work?
We're not put to use.
What's mom doing?
She's doing this stuff for us.
So remember now, you guys are parasites, right? You're still parasites. But back then, you were real parasites just on mom. And I said to my kids too, Dad, my wife gets mad at me too. But so when the embryo is in mom, the embryo has a digestive system, but it's not functional. Has a respiratory system, but it's not functional because those things are required after the individual is born. They don't get activated until the individual is born. So at this point right here, at some point, so it's roughly around 4 months or so, that the division between the early embryo and the late embryo here. The late embryo has a couple of sections here, and if you look at the forebrain then divides into two areas right here called the telencephalon and the diencephalon, and I've already mentioned what the diencephalon is, and we talked about it already, and so the diencephalon is present in the adult structures here. The telencephalon then develops as an adult into the cerebrum, and so that's what we talked about the gray matter here. The mesencephalon remains unchanged here, not unchanged, but the same names stay right here. And then in terms of the rhombencephalon or the hindbrain here, I skip over these parts right here and I ask about the structures associated with the hindbrain. So the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. Now, in addition, I mentioned other structures associated with the brain, and those are cerebrospinal fluid. And we talked a little bit about cerebrospinal fluid in the context of the epidermal cells that make the cerebrospinal fluid, but now there's a very, very extensive, especially in comparison to the spinal cord, this very extensive ventricle system that houses cerebrospinal fluid. That houses the cerebrospinal fluid areas associated with the forebrain or formerly the prosencephalon. Here are the lateral and the third ventricles. Right here, so the third ventricle is associated with the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The lateral ventricles, there's very, very big spaces there. Again, that's going to be containing cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal fluid here is going to flow from the lateral ventricles generally to the third ventricle. It's going to then go to a narrow canal called a cerebral aqueduct, and inferior to the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle is largely between the pons and the cerebellum, and so it's largely between these two structures right here. And then if the cerebrospinal fluid goes inferior from there, it will then go to the central canal and then continue inferiorly. If you look at these things right here, there's lots of general functions. Here. So higher brain functions, what does that mean? So emotions, learning, things like that. Autonomic nerve control here. That's the diencephalon. Autonomic nervous system. We're going to get to the autonomic nervous system in next week, and we'll talk about that in the context of the diencephalon. These reflex centers, so there's a reflex center, and a reflex center. Those reflex centers are associated with the cranial nerves that are attached right there. If you look right here, muscle coordination and balance, right here, that is largely the function of the cerebellum. So the fact that I can do this and stand on one leg with my eyes closed, I have my eyes closed now, I forgot to close them. Right now I'm falling over. The fact that I didn't fall over and hit the ground, right, that's a function of the cerebellum and then a number of different other information. Right, so the information, so now I have all my weight on my right foot, right, and now the information is going to my cerebellum and it's saying we have to worry about balance, and then that
the balance function of it, if any of you have ever been seasick or car sick or motion sickness, right, that balance part is a function of your ears area. So that's something for AMP2. Balance is, and muscle coordination is really a complicated thing, and it's got a lot to do with the sensory nervous system coming from the joints and the muscles, because the muscles now, some muscles are contracting, other muscles are relaxing, and when the muscles that are contracting are going to send sensory information to the brain, and it's going to go to the cerebellum. When you talk about the brain, you also, again, there's more overlap between the brain and the spinal cord. There's coverings of the brain or protections of the brain. There's the first part of the, well, first of all, the coverings of the brain, the most substantial covering associated with the brain is the skull. Okay, and deep to the skull are these series of meninges, and the meninges are the same, they have the same names generally as what are covered in the spinal cord. So there's the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And the one thing that's very consistent here between spinal cord and the brain is that the pia mater is touching the nervous tissue, the gray matter. I mentioned areas, the spaces surrounding the brain, those are called ventricles, and those ventricles have cerebral spinal fluid, and so there's cerebral spinal fluid. Where is the cerebral spinal fluid made? They're made in the choroid plexuses, and the choroid plexus is an area where there's lots of blood flow there, and there's a significant number of epidermal cells that these specialized neuroglia that make cerebral spinal fluid. In addition to that, they also have modified the extensive cilia, and so they are able to produce flow, cerebral spinal fluid flow within the ventricle. And then finally, the blood-brain barrier. I won't talk a lot about the blood-brain barrier, but it's basically a way of protecting the brain, keeping everything that the brain needs a significant amount of nutrients and things like that, but you're trying to protect it from getting too much. One thing about that is significantly different from the spinal cord, in addition to the ventricles right here, so the ventricles and the blood-brain barrier here, but the dura mater and the meninges are very different in the brain than in the spinal cord. So one thing that is really easy for me to ask is which of the following is a function of or has a structure of the brain or has a structure of the spinal cord. And so again, you have to remember the structures, coverings of the meninges of the spinal cord and comparing it to the brain. So these meninges right here are the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, and that's consistent between both structures of the cerebral, of the central nervous system. There's spaces as well. Now notice here for the brain, notice what space that's missing here. There's a subdural space and subarachnoid space. What space is missing is the epidural space. So we don't give epidural shots in the brain. And the reason why, well, there's a couple, but not the least of which is that there's not a lot of space there. There's something different about it. What? Oh, okay. So some of these things are very consistent, others are not right here in terms of the layers right here. Now, if you look right there, this is, well, again, when I ask in mini practical 4, what is the most superficial covering protection of the brain? The most superficial protection of the brain technically will be, for those of you who have hair, would be hair, but skin, and then deep to that would be the skull. Right? So where I'm pointing at is the skull. So that's the most superficial and significant covering of the brain. But deep to that, then there's the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And again, that pia mater is directly touching the nervous tissue. In addition to the brain differences between the spinal cord and the brain, we haven't talked about sinuses in the spinal cord, And I showed several of you, there's areas of the spinal cord where there's arterioles or small arteries or small veins that go up and down parallel to the spinal cord. But here there is an area called a sinus, and that sinus is, the brain has an awful lot of blood flow getting going to it. It's arterial blood flow that's going to the brain, and it bathes the brain cells in blood and plasma, and then you got to get rid of it. So where does it go? Well, the blood flow in a venous blood is very, very slow, so it has to go somewhere, and so it goes to the sinuses. So let's talk about the dura mater. The dura mater is deep to the skull, but it's attached to the skull. So it's attached to the skull. And several of you in your mini practical, the last mini practical, were talking about the periosteum and the periosteum associated with the spinal cord here. So that's not terribly relevant, but here it is. First of all, the periosteum, if you remember, and I know that you all will, the periosteum is the superficial layer of tissue that helps lay down bone, the bone matrix. There's an acellular layer of it that's structural, that helps with the integrity of it, that's physical, and then there's a cellular portion of it. There's an area of, and so that's part of the periosteum, regardless of what bone we're talking about here. So this part right here, the dura mater, has an outer periosteal dura and an inner meningeal dura. That meningeal dura is much more complicated and ornate, and the periosteal dura is basically the acellular portion of it. The dura mater also has these three seat belts of consequence here, and they're called dural folds. Those dural folds, they come in three different names here. So there's the falx cerebrae, tentorium cerebelli, and the falx cerebelli. Those last two are associated with the cerebellum, right? And the first one is associated with the cerebrum, or the cerebellar hemispheres. So these are very, very well developed dura mater areas, and they basically help keep the brain in place, and it keeps it immobile. So these act as seatbelts. In addition, here I mentioned just a minute ago, there's also spaces within the dura mater that houses blood temporarily, and then that blood then goes inferiorly, collects into larger and larger spaces, and then it goes into the circulatory system. Those sinuses, or the dural venous sinuses here, were not arterial sinuses. There are no such things. So arteries carry blood to the brain, or arterioles carry blood to the brain, and then vein or venule carry blood from the brain. They pool in specific areas of the brain. That blood pools in areas called the sinuses, and it drains blood and cerebrospinal fluid from the brain. So the next layer, deep to the dura mater, is the arachnoid matter, and that arachnoid matter is consistent with the spinal cord here. So that thin layer there has lots of spaces within it, and deep to that is the subdural space here. Superficial to that is the subdural space, and then there's also the subarachnoid space, right? So the subdural space is between the dura and the arachnoid matter, so that's deep to the dura mater. Again, that is going to have a small amount of fluid. It's not a very large structure. So this thin wispy layer here called the arachnoid matter is connecting the dura mater to the brain itself and the pia mater. And that pia mater follows the contours, the external contours of the brain. So of the three areas of the brain, the three layers of the brain, the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater, the one that follows the bumps and the ridges of the brain, the hills and valleys of the brain, we'll talk about what those are in a second, is called the pia mater. The space that's superficial to the pia mater is called the subarachnoid space. And again, that's deep to the arachnoid layer and superficial to the pia mater. So those are differences between the, comparisons between the dural folds or the meninges of the brain and the spinal cord here. Another major difference between the brain and the spinal cord is the amount of cerebral spinal fluid that bathes the brain in it. So the brain has both plasma, blood plasma, doesn't have a lot of blood cells bathing the brain, but blood plasma, and then also cerebral spinal fluid bathing the brain. So there are major areas of the brain that has cerebral spinal fluid. Those are lateral ventricles that are associated with the cerebral hemispheres. And there's a little septum that divides those lateral ventricles, and that little dividing area, that paper thin area right here, is called the septum pellucidum. That septum pellucidum there, again, is going to be dividing the individual ventricles, the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles meet, and then they merge to go inferior, right about the level of the diencephalon here, and that's at the third ventricle. So the lateral ventricles are very large, and the third ventricle is centrally located. It's much smaller. And inferior from that, there's a small canal called the cerebral aqueduct, and that goes to the fourth ventricle. And that fourth ventricle, and then if the cerebral spinal fluid stays in it, that fourth ventricle then will be continuous with the central canal. That fourth ventricle is between the pons and medulla, again, or generally what we're talking about. If you look at this picture right here, it shows you some the major ventricles right here. There are areas of the, so starting from the inferior portion, the central canal is right here, this yellow area. Now, and going superior right here, we have the fourth ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct continues here and to the third ventricle. This circle right here, doesn't have any of this third ventricle, the cerebral spinal fluid liquid in there. That space that spot where my pointer is called the interthalamic adhesion. That's where the right and the left thalamus are attached right here, and then around those thalamic areas right here are is the third ventricle. There's a foramen that goes superior, interventricular foramen. That interventricular foramen, which is right here, goes superior to the lateral ventricles. And then the ventricles themselves have horns. And those areas of so the ventricle is sort of C-shaped. There is an anterior horn that is associated with the frontal and the parietal lobe right here. There's a posterior horn associated with the occipital lobe. And then an inferior horn associated with the temporal lobe. And again, these are all part of one lateral ventricle, and that lateral ventricle again houses cerebral spinal fluid. All right, so I think what I want to do is I want to take a break right now. Let me see here. It is 9:40, so come back in 10 minutes.